And indeed, Washington's going even further, preparing sanctions against the Syrian political elite and a freeze of their assets. Iran's Revolutionary Guards also set to be penalised for allegedly providing material support to Damascus in another development. Let's bring into the conversation American radio host Stephen Lendman. He's joining us on Skype live from Chicago to discuss these latest developments in the Arab world and the US role maybe in them. Thanks for being on the programme. I mean, if this news about these imminent sanctions proves to be correct, it does breathe, doesn't it, more fire into the theory that Washington is getting increasingly involved in what's happening in Syria, and it's also targeting Iran now, crucially, too.
Oh, absolutely, Kevin. Well, Washington's been involved in Syria going back last year, the year before last. Coincidentally, I put out a new article today, and I call it U.S. Intervention in Syria. There have been some reports on American intervention, recruiting youths, recruiting criminals to get out on the streets across Syria and incite violence. So, of course, the Syrian regime, which is not a friendly regime, it's a despotic regime, but even democracies don't take incited violence very lightly. So the response, the Syrian government response, has been very robust. But if this happened in my own city of Chicago, the response on the streets would be just as robust. I assure viewers, the Chicago police, with U.S. help thrown in, can be just as militant, just as brutal as what's going on by the Syrian government to their own people across the country.
All right, OK, well, that's looking into it. Let's go back to this theory we were putting forward earlier on about maybe targeting Iran. I mean, if Iran is the end target here, how far do you think Washington will push its agenda?
Oh, I think Iran is the end target. And the game may be to de-link the countries in Iran's orbit. You've got a sort of coalition among Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah now running the Lebanese government, Hamas in Gaza. In Gaza and Fatah just created a unity pact of sorts. We need to wait to see how that plays out. I just wrote about that as well. I'm a little dubious about it, but there is an official unity pact. Apparently, the T's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed, the I's have been dotted, but we need to see what will happen in fact. And then we've got Iran. So if Iran can be separated and kept alone, de-linked from the other allies they have, then the next target could be Iran. First, take
how much of a can of worms, Stephen, would that be?
I'm sorry?
How much of a can of worms would Iran be? How problematic would it be? What sort of problems would it open if the US went to war with Iran and pushed it further?
Well, I think war is always a last option for America. So what's going on in Syria right now is planned regime change. If there can be enough incitement in the streets to get the Syrian people mad enough, well, the Syrian government has resigned, supposedly. So there have been changes. The emergency law has either been taken off the books, canceled or suspended or whatever. If there are incremental changes and it leads to a new regime in Syria, then America can accomplish its objective by regime change rather than going to war. But if it doesn't work, then watch for the Marines to come in, maybe. The same thing could happen in Yemen. The idea is to change what's going on that isn't working too well, get new faces in to continue the same policies, Western-friendly policies in Yemen, a new regime adopting Western-friendly policies in Syria, meaning de-linking from Iran, then go to work on Hezbollah in Syria, in Lebanon, go to work on Hamas in Gaza, and if you can completely isolate Iran, then stoke street violence there, go again for regime change, and if nothing works, the last option is war.
And how does Libya fit into the picture? I mean, yet again today, Tripoli has been calling for peace talks. Gaddafi's asked the NATO-led coalition to stop bombing the country. They, in turn, have said they'll only do that if he stops attacking the rebels. It does seem to be going around in circles, doesn't it? But is the coalition really doing enough at all levels to bring peace to Libya any time soon, do you think, really?
Well, I call the rebels what they are. They're insurgents. and they're insurgents. There absolutely is a popular uprising. There's a popular uprising in Syria. There's a popular uprising across the entire region. But they vary. They're uprisings. They're not revolutions. Syria is different from all the rest. Libya is different from all the rest. It's an insurgency. It's a Western-inspired insurgency. This is a rising in Syria as well. You've got the same scenario on a smaller scale going on in Syria, but this is Western-instigated, Western-inspired, Western-funded. The intervention has nothing to do with human rights.
So what's your prognosis then for Libya?
Oh, it's a bad prognosis. I think the war will continue until Gaddafi is out. The ideal is to have one of these missiles have a lucky strike and be able to kill Gaddafi. They absolutely want to get rid of him. And if you weigh him up against the other regional despots, he is by far the best. If you had to live in a despotic country, you would want Gaddafi to be the head of it, because Gaddafi has given the Libyan people some wonderful social benefits that you don't find in countries like Syria or Yemen or Egypt or most of the other countries, but Gaddafi has done it. If he goes, even the anti-Gaddafi forces in Libya will yearn to have him back, just the way the Iraqis yearn to have Saddam back, because he gave the Iraqi people wonderful social benefits, free education, free health care. Gaddafi has done the same thing.
In one of your articles, Stephen, lately, you talk about America's thirst for waging so-called, this is the crucial bit, war for peace. It begs the question, doesn't it, then, well, why aren't we seeing Washington doing exactly the same thing in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, where protesters have also been brutally put down? Why?
It kind of gives the word hypocrisy a bad name. I mean, there is brutality on the streets of Bahrain now, a tiny country, about 1.2 million people. Horrendous brutality. I wrote 2 articles about it. I mean, they're shooting people dead in the streets. They're arresting people. They're targeting hospitals. They're arresting doctors, nurses, and medical staff. It is utter brutality. U.S. Getting the Saudis to do their dirty work, but the Saudis wanted to do it as well, because what happens in Bahrain may happen in Saudi Arabia, and it already has happened in Saudi Arabia to a much lesser extent. And you don't see any reports about this, but there've been protests on Saudi streets. Saudis are very, very brutal, and they will do to their own citizens what they're doing to the Bahrainis. But in Washington, they're barely saying a word about it. On U.S. media, you hear nothing about the brutality in Bahrain, but you certainly hear about all the nasty things Gaddafi is doing. Talk about hypocrisy.
Radio host Stephen Lendman, always good to have you on the programme here. Your thoughts online from Chicago tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.